You're laughing. Try to get all this situated. Here's what's interesting. This is ridiculous. I get it. And yes, that was me, because I struggled to manage everything in my life sometimes. That dropped the guitar case back there a minute ago and made that loud crash. So if you all up here at the front kind of got startled, that was my bad. Here's what's funny about the laughter in the room today. I think this is a picture of our lives. Every single one of us. This is ridiculous. I mean, it is. But I think it represents pretty accurately the way most of us live every single day of our life. We pile on and we pile on and we add more to our routine, more to our plate, more to our schedule, more responsibility, more obligation, more job responsibilities, all these things. And here's what's interesting. I'm not saying any of those things are bad, because I can handle this. I mean, I got from there to here, so all right, we're winning. And you can handle it, and you could probably put a little more on my plate, figuratively speaking. Like I could probably add a little bit more and still be okay. However, there's gonna come a point where this isn't okay, and I need to put it all down. And I think it's a picture that I want us to see for ourselves and see ourselves in. As we live just everyday life, I think we find ourselves exhausted. In the world of setting 8 alarms on your iPhone to wake you up, in the world of energy drink sales, don't worry, I've got mine, just in case this gets a little overwhelming and I need a little pick-me-up. In the world of melatonin to go to sleep, like, isn't it fascinating how much we look to caffeine to stay awake, because we want to fall asleep all day, and as soon as we lay our head down at night, we can't go to sleep. I'm pretty confident we've all probably heard someone say this week, I'm tired. Anybody hear someone say this week, I'm tired? Now, all of us, because we're tired. Some of you are pointing at your neighbor, your spouse, your friend, I get it. But we've all been there. So my point is I think that there's a time in our life where we're supposed to carry a lot. We're designed to be able to carry a lot. We're designed to be able to operate and function at a really high level and multitask and do all kinds of things really, really well, and that's different for different people. But there comes a point in our lives where we need to take it all off and we need to disconnect from all of it. We need to set it to the side, because it's not leaving us with good results in our lives. We live in a culture, you and I, and we participate in this culture where we're overworked, overwhelmed by the responsibilities at the workplace, or overwhelmed by the responsibilities because you work in the most difficult place to work as a stay-at-home mom, taking care of kiddos, and even more than kiddos, the husband who might be there. Like, you're taking care of it's overwhelming. It's a lot. I read a study a couple years ago that says that the U.S., the average worker in the United States works more hours per year, on average, than several other developed countries in the world. Americans work 137 more hours a year than the average full-time worker in Japan. We work 260 more hours than the British. And you're like, duh, Wes, that's a no-brainer. Just kidding, if you're British. Check this out. We work 499 more hours than the French. A study in 2022 states that more than 50% of full-time workers feel burned out as a result of just their job demands. Like, we live in a culture that's probably overworked, and it's not always somebody else's fault. Not only are we overworked, but we're tired. We sleep less today than we've ever slept in the history of the world. Before electricity, before the light bulb was created, the average person slept 10 to 11 hours a night. Like, can you imagine? Today, the average is 6 to 6.5 hours. Anybody sleep less than 6 hours on average night? Like, I'm not shaming you, because that's probably a lot of us. Like, we're sleeping less, and we were actually designed to sleep more. We also are not only overworked and tired, but we're incredibly distracted. Did you know the average person, check this out, the average person who has a smartphone touches the screen of their smartphone to interact with something on average 1,167 times per day. That's crazy. The average person spends 3.5 hours a day looking at the screen of the smart device that they carry around with them. Like, if we're not working or we're not sleeping, we're most likely engaged with something on a smartphone that's keeping our attention, which isn't always bad, but what it does is it actually leads us to a place of constantly being focused on something that we actually begin to think is important, but it's not really important, it's just urgent. And I think it's 75% of individuals sleep with a smartphone next to their bed. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand for that. 90% of those, the first thing they do when they wake up after they turn off their alarm is they spend 5 to 10 minutes laying in their bed checking their phone, checking the Facebook updates, checking the email, looking at the text messages. And it's causing some chaos in our lives. It's causing what I think we can call burnout. And so that's what I want us to talk about today. I want us to talk about the idea of burnout, of stress, of exhaustion. Let me clarify what those two things mean. Stress is often short-lived and related to a temporary project or event. So you got the big test coming up, or you've got the big presentation at work that you've got to present to these big-time investors, or there's something coming up that causes stress. Like, we've all walked through stressful times. We know what that looks like. What burnout is, though, is chronic stress that feels never-ending. And I think as much as we can know what stress is, I think we can also understand what burnout is, because many of us have been there, and some of us are even there right now. And so as we kind of were processing through this, I was thinking through, even last week, I almost shifted the message some last week to kind of thinking about this week and where we were going. And so what I want to do is I want to just reflect for a moment back on the story of Elijah. If you weren't here last week, you can go back and listen to that on YouTube. Just look up Church Story on YouTube and you'll find that. But we talked about specifically the struggle with depression and finding peace of mind in the struggle that we can often find ourselves in where we're depressed. But if we go back to the story of Elijah, what's interesting is we looked at chapter 19 last week, and we're going to look at a couple verses in chapter 19 today, so if you want to turn there, you can. But what's fascinating is in chapter 19, Elijah finds himself in a great place of depression. He is distressed. He is not in a good place. But if you've been in church for very long at all, or if you study anything in the Old Testament, you've probably heard the story about Elijah on Mount Carmel with the 850 false prophets, and he challenges them, and he brings fire down from heaven, rain shows up, kind of this epic mountaintop event. But prior to chapter 18 is an even more fascinating scenario and sequence of events that takes place in Elijah's life. For the sake of time, we're not going to read all those, but I think as we process some of the things, let me just kind of tell you some of the things that go on in his life prior to even getting to the event that took place on the mountain that day with all the false prophets. If you go back and you read chapter 17, I think you immediately begin to sense that the responsibility that Elijah is carrying is creating pressure in his life. It's creating stress. Because what God does is God speaks to Elijah, because Elijah is a prophet, which means he's called to communicate things from God to the people of God. And the people of Israel have turned their backs on God. They're living for themselves. They're worshiping false idols. They're doing all the things that God has instructed them not to do. And they're doing all those things anyways. So he tells Elijah, he says, Elijah, I'm going to send a famine to the land. In other words, I'm going to allow some things to happen that are going to impact the economy of Israel so that I can turn back the hearts of the people. Isn't it fascinating that the economy going in the tank might allow us to refocus back on who God is? That would never happen today. But I think you begin to sense, so Elijah has been called to communicate this message that's not a good message to all these people. I imagine the weight of that responsibility was probably a little bit overwhelming, probably created a little bit of stress. No one else can do it. I mean, you've probably felt that way. You've been in a place where you've got a job and you've got a very specific assignment, and no one else can accomplish that assignment. You have been tasked with it, so if you don't do it, it doesn't get done. That creates stress, that creates pressure. Not only did he have maybe what we would call or relate to as career pressure, but maybe he was dealing with some spiritual pressure. Because all of a sudden now he's got all this responsibility to communicate on behalf of God to the people of God. Like, what happens if I get this wrong? Elijah's a human, just like you and me. I mean, he's got some fears, he's got some flaws. he's been called, like he's probably thinking, man, if I mess this up, this isn't going to go well for me. And I think we can find ourselves there. Sometimes in our own minds, we can begin to think, man, am I doing what God approves of? Am I enough? Have I earned God's approval? Have I worked hard enough to earn God's approval? I think he's dealing with some spiritual stress. You go back and you read in chapter 17, you begin to see the sequence of events take place. The rain stops showing up. I mean, Elijah shows up at King Ahab's place and he says, hey, listen, there's not even going to be a heavy dew for 3 years. Like, it's going to dry up. And sure enough, it happens. And Elijah wasn't immune. It's not like he had this storage house of food and money and all these. Like, he experienced what the people experienced. The financial pressure, the financial security of that situation. You go back and you read in chapter 17, and as he's navigating the situation, there's a hit put out on his life. So he's probably really stressed out about just his physical safety because there were people out to kill him. Because of the message that he had sent, people thought he was responsible for what was happening, and they were not being able to hold on to what was most valuable to them. And anytime you begin to mess with something that's the most valuable thing in someone's life, you're going to see and experience the most hostility from those people. And so they're out to take Elijah out. So he's dealing with this career stress, spiritual stress, financial stress. Then he's got this relational stress. There's a lady that blames him for her son dying. I mean, this is all getting really, really heavy. And I wonder if what Elijah was experiencing is what many of us find ourselves experiencing. Before the mountaintop moment, he's in this place where he's overwhelmed. He has all kinds of pressure going on in his life. He's carrying all these things, and he can carry all these things, and you can carry all these things for a time, but you and I were designed for moments of nothing, of taking a break, of resting, of refocusing, of remembering some specific things. So all that takes place in 17. The mountaintop moment happens in chapter 18, and then we get to chapter 19, and King Ahab goes and tells his wife Jezebel what's going on, and Jezebel's not happy about it. So what does she do? This is where we read last week. She decides that she's going to do something about this. She's going to take Elijah out. And so she sends a message. Remember this? She sends a message to Elijah, and she says, I'm going to take you out. Now, Jezebel is a name that means the spirit of lying and deception. So she speaks this message. We don't have any information that leads us to believe that she actually did anything to try to take his life. She just made a threat. She sent a message. And I think it's a picture for us of what the enemy does for us. The enemy is so quick to just slide into our DMs and start sending us subtle little messages that begin to get our mind going, thinking you're not working hard enough. You need to work a little bit harder. You don't have enough. Are you secure? Do you have enough money to take care of yourself, to take care of your family? Maybe you need to work a little bit harder. There's always more that you need to do to exhaust yourself, to continue to run this crazy race. It starts messing with your relationships. You start having these thoughts of like, man, does she really love me? Is she really attracted to me? Does he really care about me? And you begin to pile all these things on. You begin to carry them as you're living out your daily life, and it leads us to a place of exhaustion. So here's Elijah. He's exhausted. He's stressed out. He's been running this crazy race for 3 years. And then the enemy sends him a message and says, I'm going to take you out. This is a guy who knows God, who's experienced the protection of God over these 3 years. God's provided for Elijah in these really unique ways, food and all the things he needs to continue to survive. He's understood some of the promises of God. He's communicated the promises of God. This is a man of great faith. The enemy sends him a message, and then in verse 2, which is where we're going to pick up today again, it says, and he was afraid, and he got up, and he ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat under a broom tree, and he asked for himself to die and said, enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. So what does he do? He's exhausted. He's been running this crazy race. So what does he do? In a moment of fear, he continues to do what he was doing. He continues to run. And he runs a long ways. Check out this map. I know this isn't really easy to see with this screen, but we read about everything that the chapter 19 starts in Jezreel. And Elijah runs all the way to Beersheba. Like, this isn't just like a half-day walk. That's 100 miles. Elijah ran 4 marathons. Like, he ran, and he continued to run, and he continued to run. And some of you are like that. Some of you are like Elijah. You like to run. You like to run marathons. Some of you are even crazy enough to run 100 miles. Like, that's fun to you. I don't understand that, and I don't know how you get your headspace there to want to run that much. This is what Elijah does. He runs, specifically, he's running because of fear. And I think there's something I want us to recognize, that there's an enemy that is always lying to us. He's always trying to send us little subtle messages that begin to get the wheels turning in our minds, to begin to give more effort, to work harder, to run faster, to take on more, to carry more. And so we run, and busy becomes the norm, and the norm is the problem. You see, I think the enemy, he knows that if you continue to live in the will of God and experience the power of God with the people of God, then you and I are going to be an unstoppable force in experiencing everything that God has created us for. So what the enemy wants to do is he wants to get in and he wants to disrupt, distract, destroy anything that God wants to do in our lives. And he does that by deceiving us and lying to us. We begin to believe the lies. We begin to repeat the lies. We begin to process and ruminate on these things in our heads. And what it does is it leads us to a place where we work. We never take a break. We never rest. And we find ourselves in a place of brokenness. Work without rest always leads to brokenness. Some of us have experienced that. And the problem is that when we experience this kind of burnout, this chronic stress, it begins to manifest itself in some unique ways in our bodies, in our minds. Physically, it begins to manifest itself. We find ourselves easily fatigued, low on energy. We have difficulty sleeping, although we're exhausted all day long. We have headaches, body aches, muscle pain, which leads us to coping mechanisms to make us feel better, to numb some of the pain. You see, it starts to manifest itself, and we feel that. And some of us have felt that. Some of us are feeling that. Not only does it manifest itself physically, but it manifests itself mentally. Ongoing stress, when we continue to live in a state of being overwhelmed, of being exhausted, it begins to change some things in our minds. 2 specific changes take place. First, it begins to enlarge the amygdala. The amygdala, it's the small almond-shaped part of our brain that is the trigger when there's something that we need to see that might be bringing danger to us. It's what causes us to fight or flight. It's an important part of our brain. God designed us that way. What happens when we find ourselves in a place of being overwhelmed and burnt out is that part of our brain becomes more vulnerable, which leads us to a place of additional fear and unnecessary anxiety. So as things are happening in our lives, the amygdala is triggered more easily. And we begin to find ourselves processing things in an unhealthy way. And we find ourselves worried and overwhelmed with the possibilities of what could happen because we're exhausted, because we've been carrying this for too long, unwilling to just set it down and disconnect from it. The other thing it does is it weakens the prefrontal cortex in our brain. This is the part of our brain that we use to make decisions. The decision-making process takes place in the prefrontal cortex. Maybe you were in a place in your life where you used to be really confident about the decisions you made. You were really confident about your judgment. And you're like, man, I was always a person, if something needed to be decided or if something needed to be figured out, people would come to me. But now I find myself in a place where I can't even make a decision. I can get all the information, but I almost just become paralyzed, unable to really process clearly. I get confused easily. And I'm unable to decide on anything, which just leads us to a place of feeling stuck. It's because the prefrontal cortex is weakened because we're exhausted and stress has become overwhelming. Not only that, but there's an emotional manifestation. We begin to experience a lack of motivation, total loss of self-confidence, chronic feelings of self-doubt. We begin to think to ourselves, I'm a failure. I'm not anything like everybody else. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't look good enough. We begin to think these thoughts more than we should in an unhealthy way. We find ourselves in a place of isolation. We've talked about that over the last couple of weeks. Maybe one of the most dangerous things is we find ourselves in a place where we're exhausted and we're overwhelmed, where we become incredibly negative. We're cynical about everything. We begin to think about all the things in our life and things that used to bring us joy, things that used to bring us happiness, things that we used to run to for just life. All of a sudden, we don't enjoy those things anymore. I don't like my job. I don't like to do much. I don't like my family. I don't like my wife like I should like my wife. I don't like my kids the way I should like my kids. I don't like my neighbors. I find myself not liking most of the things in my life, which also can lead to some spiritual implications. We become disconnected from God, bitter. God, do you even care? God, are you out there? Are you paying attention? I'm not sure that I really trust you. You see how dangerous this is? I think this is where Elijah found himself, which can lead to a lot of other things that we've talked about for the last couple of weeks. It can lead to increased anxiety. It can lead to depression. It can lead to all of these things. But this is what we see, I think, in the life of Elijah. Leading up to chapter 19, we see this fatigue, this exhaustion, this stress, this burnout. I think we can find ourselves in the same place, taking on everything we could possibly take on. Got to pay the bills, got to take care of the kids, got to do all the things. And it's dangerous. And some of us have experienced that. So we run, and then adversity strikes. Somebody wants to take you out, and you don't have anything left in the tank to survive the adversity. It's a dangerous place to be. This is where Elijah is. But notice what he does in verse 5. It says, then he lay down and fell asleep under a broom tree. Last week I read this verse. I said, maybe the best thing you could do is just go home and take a nap today. And some of you did that. I did that, and it was great. But I want to press into this a little bit more today. I think what maybe Elijah did is maybe he unintentionally got this right. And maybe he did it out of just pure, like he had no other option. He was at the end of himself. But regardless, he found himself in a place where he finally stopped running, and he paused, and he got still, and he took a break. And there's something powerful that takes place when that happens. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and then rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So this is God we're talking about. In the very beginning, God created everything there is in 6 days. And on the seventh day, he rested. So day 1, he created light. Day 2, he created the sky. Day 3, there was land and plants and trees. Day 4 was the sun and the moon and the stars. Day 5 was the sea creatures and the creatures in the sky. And then day 6, he created animals on the ground and humans. And on all the other things, he said, he created them and it was good. But then when it says that he created humans in God's image and his image, that it was not just good, but it was very good. And then on day 7, he rested. So this is one of those messages where a lot of times God says, hey, do this, or avoid that. But right here, we get to see not only is God saying, do this, but he's saying, do as I do. God practices a Sabbath, which comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat. It means to literally do nothing. So work 6 days, exhaust yourself for 6 days, wear yourself out for 6 days, but day 7, do nothing. Take a break, disconnect, disengage. Allow your mind some space. Allow your schedules to create some margin. Not just to sit and stare at the sky and do nothing, but allow your mind to think about things that aren't this. Like just push that to the side for a little bit. That's what this is talking about. That's what it means to take a Sabbath. If you back up to verse 8 in Exodus chapter 20, we just read verse 11. I'm not going in order. That bothers some of you. It bothers me, but I did it anyways. Verse 8 says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now, some of you are picking up on this. Like, this is one of the 10 commandments. This is one of the 2 places you read the 10 commandments in Scripture, Exodus chapter 20. He starts off and he says, first commandment, I'm the Lord your God. You should have no other gods before me. Then he talks about having no idols. And then he talks about not misusing his name, which one day I'm going to teach a sermon on that because I think we get that really wrong and what that means. And then in verse 4, he says, do nothing. Thou shalt do nothing. And then he goes on and he talks about honoring your parents and don't kill anybody, don't steal anything, don't lie to anybody, don't covet anything. but thou shalt do nothing. Thou shalt take a Sabbath. Consider Moses is up on the mountaintop. God speaks to Moses, and he inscribes these things in the stones. And Moses is probably thinking, okay, no gods before you. I get that. That makes sense. No idols. I agree, God. Like, man, I don't even know why people run to idols. Yes, that's a no-brainer. Don't misuse your name. That's a little bit unclear to me, but I think I know what you're talking about, God. And then he says, do nothing. Like, observe the Sabbath. Wait, what? Because, listen, what had just happened is he had just led them out of Egypt. And they were in the wilderness, and they were trying to raise up a nation for themselves. They were going to have to work. They were going to have to get busy. They had to hustle. And God's saying, hey, hustle, but don't forget to stop. Don't forget to pause. Don't forget to rest. Here's what's fascinating about this, is we can read this, and this can seem so old-fashioned and religious. And here's what's kind of twisted about this, and I'm guilty of this. We can walk around in our culture, in our lives, and actually brag about not observing the fourth commandment. Like, nobody walked in here today and was like, yeah, I cheated on my wife this week. Like, nobody did that. Like, that makes you really uncomfortable just to hear me say that. Like, that's bizarre. Nobody said, man, you know what? I didn't really tell the truth at all this week. I think everything I said, everything that came out of my mouth was total garbage. Like, it was all a lie. Like, nobody does that. But we'll walk into church. Notice I said I'm guilty of this. And we'll say, man, I am so tired. I can't remember the last time I took a day off. And it's almost like we wear it like a badge of honor. Like, look at me. Look how hard I work. And I think what God's saying, he's saying, you fool, what are you doing? You weren't created for that. You were created for rest. I designed you to be like me, and even I rested on the seventh day. There's something important about taking a break, pushing pause. And as we push pause, you can continue to study some of the text, and it begins to talk about remember who God is. Remember creation. Remember that he redeemed. You can read that in Deuteronomy. You can read where the other spot in the Bible, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, where it talks about the Ten Commandments, and it specifically says to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt and that God brought you out. He's talking about don't ever forget what God did for you. And then he's giving these 10 commandments. They're not a condition for the relationship. He's not saying do these things so that we can have a relationship. They're actually proof of the relationship, because he already established the relationship when he rescued them from slavery in Egypt. That's what he's saying. He's saying, hey, live in this relationship, and this is one of the ways that you can live in that relationship. I know this is extreme. I mean, you read in verse 10, he presses in on it even more. He says, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. So in other words, he's saying, hey, don't think you're smarter than me. Don't try to outsmart me. Take a break. And to take a break doesn't mean delegate all the work to somebody else on the seventh day so you can take a break. He's saying, no, take a break. Completely disengage and allow those around you to disengage. Intentionally take a step away from the demands of life, the responsibilities, the obligations, the expectations, and just disengage. There's something life-giving here. I think there's something for us to pay attention to because we live in a culture that is burnt out. Here's what we have a tendency to do. Some of us can listen to a message like this, and we're going to think to ourselves, oh, man, I'm working too hard. Did you hear that, guys? He just said, slow down. And we'll go to the extreme, and we'll overcorrect, which is dangerous. Because here's the other thing that I think is true that we can recognize just quickly is that rest without work is called laziness, all right? Rest without work is laziness. You and I were created to work. We were created to manage and carry responsibilities. If you don't work, you don't need rest. And I'm not just talking about a 9-to-5 job, because there's responsibilities that don't have compensation attached to them that are legitimate. That's maybe even more work than what's on the job description. But we're called to hustle. God did this. God hustled for 6 days, and then he took a break. So what does that mean? Well, for some, I think it means maybe the peace of mind that you've been waiting for is waiting on you to take some steps and begin to leverage what God has created in you the gifts, the design, the skills, the abilities, the experiences, and begin to leverage those for something. Sure, to make a living for yourself, but to leverage those for something where God begins to get the honor, and he begins to give you platforms and opportunities to begin to point people to him. Because rarely is anybody looking at the bum who doesn't want to work and say, man, I want my life to look like that. I wonder, why does he live that way? Why does she live that way? Nobody looks at someone that's lazy and thinks that. But when Christ followers recognize who they are and how God designed them, and they begin to live in that, there's something supernatural that I think begins to take place. And people begin to take notice. And they say, man, there's something different about that guy. There's something different about that girl. What is it? I think we've all been called to live that way. Genesis 2, verse 15 says, then the Lord, I don't think this is on the screen, but this is just, I think, some reinforcement. It says, then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. In other words, he said, hey, listen, I created you and I created all this. This is the Garden of Eden. That's perfect. It's great. It's awesome. Now get to work, son. You got some work to do. Here's your to-do list. Eve fell in love with a gardener. Sometimes I'm like, you know what? I need to bring that spark back in my marriage. And I just go out and start pulling weeds in the garden. And Brady's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm just bringing sexy back. It's what God called me to do. I'm just called to cultivate and keep it. So I'm just cultivating and keep it. You like it? And she's like, you're ridiculous. My point is that we're called to work. And we're going to work in heaven. This is something that's going to continue because we were designed that way. Now, those first two responses are problematic. They create issues. The adequate response, when we begin to think about this, to really unplug, to disconnect, to pause and take a minute to focus on who we are, on who created us, who restored us, who brought us back into a good standing with God. We begin to allow our minds to rest around that. We disengage from those things. We begin to fill ourselves back up with the things that are good that God has given us. Something begins to happen. But that only happens when we work hard and we connect that with rest. And when we do that, I think we find wholeness. Because the desire and the reason that we do all of this and that we try to carry all this is because there's something in us that's missing. There's a void that we feel. We feel like I'm not enough, and so I need to work harder. I don't have enough, so I need to work harder. People don't value me enough. I'm not worth enough, so I need to work harder to prove to people my worth. But here's what God wants us to see. He wants us to say, hey, listen, work and do what you've been called to do and honor God in all the things that he's called you to do when it comes to work, but then rest and remember whose you are. Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. Remember what God has done for you. And when you do that and you begin to see that void in your life, you realize that that's the only thing that's able to fill that void. And you begin to experience this wholeness that God wants us to live with. What would it look like for us to rest? Like to literally take a day. And I know some of you are thinking, Wes, you don't know my life. You don't know all the things I have to do in my job. You don't understand what it looks like to run the company that I run. You don't know what it looks like to take care of the kids that I have to take care of. And you're right, I don't. But God does. And it's not like God led us to do this or called us to do what's best for us all those years ago and then was like, oh man, I missed it. Like they're super busy. They don't have time to take a day off. That's crazy. That's way too radical. I need to back off some. No, what he said then is still true now. So it really comes down to a trust issue. Am I going to trust what I can do in 7 days? Or am I going to trust what God can do as I trust him with 7 days by taking 1 day to just completely take a break and then work like crazy on those other 6? Now, it doesn't mean that God's calling you as an employer to require your employees to work 6 days a week, okay? I don't think that's what, this is a different culture, different time. Because every single one of us have work to do that's not attached to our job responsibilities, and you need time to do that as well. But what does it look like to begin to trust, to literally take a day and it's just like, I'm not gonna do anything that requires me to work? What would that look like? If you go back to the story with Elijah, it says, then he lay down, verse 5, then he lay down and fell asleep. under a broom tree. But behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, "Arise, eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a round loaf of bread baked on hot coals and a pitcher of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. You know what's interesting is I think in that moment, what was the greatest need that Elijah had out in the wilderness where he had literally run to die? Food, water, and rest. Where did it come from? Not anything Elijah did. Elijah finally just stopped. And when he finally stopped, God pursued. God created a plan, and he met Elijah in his exhaustion, and he gave him everything that he needed. He said, eat, drink. And then what did he do? He goes back to sleep because he needed rest. And some of us are there. We're in that place we're burnt out. And maybe we're not telling anybody, and we're holding it all together, and we're just pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and just keep pressing through. But can I just tell you, the best way to push through is to stop pushing through and just stop and rest. God pursues Elijah. He coordinated a plan to rescue him in his most despairing moment. It says later, if you go into verse 11, Elijah, he eats and goes back to sleep, and then he eats again, and he begins this journey for 40 days and 40 nights, and he finds himself in a cave, resting again. And in verse 11 it says, "And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and powerful wind was tearing out the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire," don't miss fire, fire. Wes needs some rest. "After the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' And then Elijah begins to communicate back to him and says, 'God, this is what's going on. This is what's going on.'" I think it's easy to miss this. Notice that God didn't tell Elijah, Elijah, God here, can we talk? He shows up, there's this crazy chaos going around, all this noise, rocks are flying off the mountains, this wind's blowing really hard, and then God speaks to Elijah in a gentle voice. And Elijah responds immediately. Why? Because he recognized the voice. Because this was a man of God who had found himself in a place of burnout, in a place of depression. And he hears the gentle voice of God. Why is the voice gentle? Because when you know somebody, you don't have to scream and shout to get their attention. Sometimes the greatest way to show that you care, that you love, is just to speak in a kind, gentle voice. So God shows up pursuing his son. He says, "Hey, what are you doing, Elijah? What are you doing here?" And he begins this restoration process. What would it look like for us to come to a place in our lives where we push pause? And maybe you're in a place where you're like, "Wes, that's so drastic and extreme to just take a whole day and disconnect. Like, what? There's no way I can do that right now." Listen, don't get overwhelmed with the length of time. Just start creating some time. Create some space. Maybe it's 2 hours, because just 2 hours would be an extreme step. But what would it look like for us to carve out some margin, some space, and just say, "Hey, I'm going to create some time to disengage and hear from God"? What would that look like for us? What would God begin to do? What kind of energy would we maybe begin to restore back into our souls that we're looking to all these other things to restore for us? What would it begin to look like? Because here's what I think is true. And I think it's true based on what I see in Scripture, and I think many of us could probably say this is true because of what we've experienced. But I think that there's extraordinary peace found in ordinary moments with God. Ordinary moment. Like, it's not like he said, "Hey, take a break, go on a journey, climb a mountain, find this tree, get underneath this tree, make this plan." He just says, just stop. Like, don't do anything. Disengage. Put down the phone. Stop letting the phone be a leash around your neck, leading you to take care of all these things. Because anytime the phone goes off, it's real easy to think, "Oh my gosh, I just got a text message, or I just got an email, or I just got this notification. My fantasy football roster isn't updated yet. I gotta finalize my roster." Like, all these things, and they're urgent, and they almost feel like a crisis sometimes, but they're not always important. And sometimes we let the urgent distract us from what's important, and it leads us to a place of burnout. So what would it look like for us to do this? I woke up super early this morning. That's typically what happens on Sundays. 3:50 this morning, I woke up, my alarm went off just once. I don't hit my snooze on Sunday mornings because it's the one morning Brandy doesn't get up as early as I do, so if I hit the snooze and it goes off a second time, it turns into an abusive relationship, and that's not good. And I'm joking. But the first thought I had as I got out of bed is like, I don't know where this came from, but it was this idea. Actually, I know where it came from because I was sitting there. One of the weird things that pastors do is we want to make like everything rhyme and go together and start with the same letter in our messages, and so that it's easy to remember. And so I was thinking, what rhymes with peace? Like, I want peace in my exhaustion. What is it? And I don't know why, but cease and desist came to mind. And I was like, cease and desist? I don't even know what that means, I don't think. And I was like, I think I know what that means, and so I looked it up. And here's what I did. At 4:15 this morning, I typed out a letter, a cease and desist letter to myself. I'm gonna read this to you. Maybe you need to just take my name out and put your name there. But here's what I wrote to myself this morning. Dear Wes, I'm requesting that you cease and desist, which, by the way, if you're like me and you're like, I think I know what that means, but I'm not confident, it means really just to stop doing whatever inappropriate behavior that you might be doing. Sometimes it means unlawful behavior. So, dear Wes, I'm requesting that you cease and desist the inappropriate and disruptive behavior you are demonstrating in your life. Your behavior is unhealthy and wreaking havoc in your life and the lives of those around you. Any further inappropriate behavior will lead to mental, physical, and emotional burnout and lay the foundation for a mental breakdown. You will not be able to afford the damages that are being accumulated by the pace in which you are running. Additionally, the cost associated with failing to make proper adjustments to your behavior may include broken relationships, loss of purpose, chronic conflict, and much more. Moving forward, please put into practice a routine of rest. What would that look like for us? Because it's not enough for us to just sit here and think, okay, I need to stop working so hard. Maybe more importantly, we need to put together a plan for rest. Like literally plan out your rest. What would that look like for you? You know, we make budgets for our money because we know we have a limited amount of money and we need to make a plan for where we're going to spend it. What would it look like for us to take our time that we have limited time, all the same amount of time, take that time and begin to budget out our time, to plan out our time and say, hey, here's my week. And I'm going to get into schedule the things that are important. Like this is a super practical step that we can put into place starting today. Like in the rest of your day today, take out some time and just say, hey, I'm gonna plan out my week. And maybe some of you already do this, but what would it look like for us to do that? Here's what I would say you start with. The first thing you need to schedule in your week, rest. Rest like we've read about today. Disengage, remember who God is, worship God, pray with God, spend some time just really some additional time soaking in more of who he is and reading some of the Bible. But not only that, don't just spend your time pursuing things. Make sure there's some things that maybe are just filling you up. Like if you work with your hands all day, every day, maybe Sabbath for you is to read a book or to begin to think through something that's completely unrelated to work. If you work with your mind all day, every day, most weeks like I do, maybe what you need to do on your Sabbath is to work with your hands and build a project or go do something outside, but it begins to fill you back up. Because it's not enough just to recognize that we're exhausted. What are we gonna do to refill ourselves and to re-energize ourselves? So what would it look like to make a plan? To disconnect, pray, rest. Schedule your rest. Schedule the time you're gonna spend with those that are most important to you. If you're married, that's your spouse. If you've got kids, then your kids come after your spouse. Man, we can get that wrong so easily and not on purpose. What would it look like to carve out time for your spouse and then for your kids and for the family together? Schedule those things first and then schedule work obligations, work responsibilities, the time that you're going to invest to make a living for yourself, for your family, to take care of yourself and your family. And then schedule in ministry, church, social life. It's amazing how much time we have when we begin to schedule it out. It's the best way that we can avoid falling prey to what's urgent, but not really important. What would it look like to make a plan? Because failure to make a plan is actually creating the perfect plan for burnout in our lives. I'll read you this verse and then we'll close. Jesus says, it's interesting, we read with Elijah that God came to Elijah and spoke in a gentle voice. Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I don't know if you're weary and burdened today, but I know where you can find rest. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble." Jesus himself says, "I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is comfortable and my burden is light." I know that there's some in here, you're exhausted. And the step that you need to take before you go start scheduling out your week and creating adequate time for everything is just to simply run to Jesus and say, "Jesus, I want to look to you. I want to focus on you. I want my attention to be on you so that you can begin to do what only you can do in my life." That's gentle, because it needs to be gentle, because I'm kind of vulnerable right now. I'm feeling pretty weak right now, so I don't need a heavy hand to come across and say, "Hey, man, you are failing at this and this and this. You need to get your act together." Jesus is just like, "Hey, man, I'm gentle and humble." What does it mean that he's humble? It means that he lowered himself to come after us. It was God's plan. Just like he planned to go after Elijah in the desert, he's come after us through his son Jesus. And our response is just to simply trust him. Would you trust him today? I want to close with this poem that I found a couple of years ago by a guy named Ted Lauder. I want to read this, and then I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing, and really just kind of carve out some space. Just pause, disconnect, put the phone away for just a little bit, and just really press into what does God want to speak to us in this moment to fill us up, especially those of us that are exhausted. But here's what Ted Lauder wrote. He said, "Holy One, God, there is something I wanted to tell you, but there have been errands to run, bills to pay, arrangements to make, meetings to attend, friends to entertain, washing to do, and I forget what it is I wanted to say to you. And mostly I forget what I'm about or why. Oh God, don't forget me, please. God, there is something I wanted to tell you, but my mind races with worrying and watching, with weighing and planning, with rutted slights and pothole grievances, with leaky dreams and leaky plumbing, and leaky relationships that I keep trying to plug up. And my attention is preoccupied with loneliness, with doubt, and with things I covet, and I forget what it is I wanted to say to you and how to say it honestly, or how to do much of anything. Oh God, don't forget me, please. Almighty One, there is something I wanted to ask you, but I stumble along the edge of a nameless rage, haunted by 100 floating fears of war, of losing my job, of failing, of getting sick and old, having loved ones die, of dying. And I forget what is the real question I wanted to ask. And I forget to listen anyway because you seem so unreal and far away sometimes, and I forget what it is I've even forgotten. Oh God, don't forget me, please. Oh Father in heaven, perhaps you've already heard what I wanted to tell you. What I wanted to ask is, in my blundering way, is don't give up on me. Don't become too sad about me, but laugh with me and try again with me. And I will with you too. Oh Father in heaven, perhaps you've already heard what I wanted to tell you. What I wanted to ask is, forgive me, heal me, encourage me, renew in me a little of love and faith and a sense of confidence and a vision of what it might mean to live as though you are real and I mattered and everyone was a sister and brother. What I wanted to ask for is peace enough to want and work for more, for joy enough to share, and for awareness that is keen enough to sense your presence here now, there, then, always.